Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Nice to see all your smiling faces.
And yours as well.
Well, let's begin, as we normally begin, with the acknowledgement of country. We remember the first peoples of this island continent, and we call to mind their knowledge, their sensitive care, and their commitment to the land and law. May we humbly and gratefully learn to participate in creation with their guidance. We honour the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and we support the creation of lasting ways of listening and consulting with the first peoples of this state. It's my privilege to introduce to you tonight Kym Bills, who's sitting at the front and ready to speak to you. Kym has been in semi-retirement since 2019, and I read the word semi-retirement, I think that's really a joke. If that's what semi-retirement does, I feel tired thinking about it. Kym is completing a PhD and is a visiting research fellow at the University of Adelaide, the School of Public Health. He was a former economist and diplomat. Kym was a career Canberra public servant from 1978 and later was employed by the CSIRO in Perth from 2011 until 2018 as CEO of a research joint venture. He first studied theology in 1981. I suspect Kym studies as his recreation. Anne, is that right?
Yes.
And as a graduate student in Oxford and completed a part-time Master of Ministry in 2005. He is a member of this church and leads worship here from time to time and is a valued member of the PCNet task group. Now, the topic tonight, and you all must know what that is because that's why you chose to be here. While many of us will be aware of the early contributions to progressive Christianity and think of such key figures as Bishop John Spong and Marcus Borg, and many of us really don't know much beyond that, I would suggest, and the diversity of more recent contributions is less well known, but it goes well beyond biblical studies to include spirituality, worship, and the arts. Progressive Christianity also embraces the wonders of new scientific discovery, environmental stewardship, and social justice. Kym will outline some of this more recent work and its contribution to the life of the church. So we will hear from Kym, and when he's finished, that will be the time for you to ask questions if you have them. And I will say it now, and I'll probably say it again. If you ask a question or have anything you wish to say, we really require you to use the microphone. And that's for the people who aren't here. Those people who will see this online will rely on us all speaking clearly into a microphone. So that's the first time of telling. Now, Kym, thank you.
Thank you, Janine, and good evening everyone here and online. Now, this large gathering may of course be because you were here for the Reverend Esmond Dowdy, who has been unwell, and you probably know we've swapped and he's now speaking on the 2nd of May. So please come back if you really wanted to hear him. But in talking tonight about the contribution of progressive Christian voices, I'm going to mention some history and a few pioneers of progressive Christianity before moving to focus on the diversity of more recent and contemporary contributions, both positive and negative reactions that are illustrative of significant contribution. I'll speak for about 35 minutes, and as Janine says, I'll be happy to take questions and short comments if she'll let you at the end, depending on how we go. The Reverend Professor Sir Lloyd Geering turned 106 on the 26th of February this year. He was ordained in the New Zealand Presbyterian Church in 1943. After studying mathematics, he became a theologian, a member of both the Jesus Seminar and Sea of Faith network, a participant in the Living the Questions program, which is an alternative to the Evangelical Alpha course, and once faced a trial for heresy after a conservative minister and layman, no women, lodged a complaint in 1967 alleging doctrinal error relating to his progressive views. Over his long life, he's lived through, participated in and led key aspects of progressive Christianity. As a centenarian, Geering joined the Intergenerational Climate Ambassadors Group in 2021. He considers both Christian and Muslim fundamentalism to be a social evil. And one of his many books is the 2013 From the Big Bang to God, Our Awe-Inspiring Journey of Evolution. Also in 2013, Sir Lloyd wrote the foreword to the excellent Why Weren't We Told?, a handbook on progressive Christianity. Geering's foreword highlights the role of English Bishop John Robinson in his 1963 book, Honest to God, that sought to popularise and make accessible to laypersons the insights and questions that liberal theologians had been grappling with for decades. Geering writes, there was nothing very new in Robinson's little book, he added the word little, for theologians who had read works by Rudolf Bultmann, Paul Tillich and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. But a great gulf had opened up between theologians and what was being preached in mainline churches. Geering thinks lay people were not told out of a pastoral concern that challenging new questions might undermine their faith. However, radical change had been managed after the dawn of Protestant liberalism in the mid-19th century, or the second half of the 19th century, leading to church vitality and growth. Called modernism in the Roman Catholic Church, this progressive liberalism was crushed by the Vatican until the reforms of the Second Vatican Council from 1962 to 1965. Within Protestantism, reaction against liberalism came from the publication of a series of booklets between 1910 and 1915 called The Fundamentals, that insisted on the literal inerrancy of the Bible and doctrines such as the penal substitution, sacrificial atonement of Christ on the cross. Such conservative fundamentalism spread from the US to Australasia. It steadily grew in strength while liberals focused on ecumenism, dialogue with other religions, social justice, and more radical ideas such as Don Cupitt's Sea of Faith TV series and movement that developed to a point where the former Church of England priest and philosopher theologian became an agnostic and a self-styled non-realist. The Jesus Seminar, jointly led by Robert Funk in the US, sought to find passages in the New Testament that could be confidently traced back to Jesus. But with too many confounding factors, it had limited success, as did earlier and periodic attempts to search for the so-called historical Jesus, which tended instead to find the Jesus of the historian. New theologies were linked to postmodernism's distrust of grand narratives and others to liberation theology, feminist theology, and so forth. Some liberal theologians and clergy sought to counter the spread of fundamentalism and began to speak of themselves as progressive Christians, who became networked around the world and in Australia, leading to the first Progressive Christianity Common Dreams Conference held in Sydney in 2007, with American Episcopalian Bishop John Shelby Spong as the keynote speaker. Bishop Jack Spong and US theologian Dr. Marcus Borg were among leaders carrying the torch for progressive Christianity. Spong spoke in Adelaide, as most of you know, in 2001 and 2003, and was the catalyst for the formation of PCNet South Australia, based here now at Christchurch. Much of what Spong wrote was not new theologically, but his writing and preaching were persuasive, and he spoke especially to those who had left mainstream churches or might be poised to do so. Borg was an acclaimed scholar with similar communication gifts. Other leaders from the Roman Catholic tradition included John Dominic Crossan and Father Richard Raw. Such progressive Christianity was comfortable with questions, dialogue, and not seeking to preach a new doctrine or require different right sets of beliefs. To discuss the contribution of newer progressive Christian voices, I'm going to draw from a group of book reviews I've written for PCNet South Australia that are available on our website, so that you can access more detail should you wish. 12 reviews were written in the past year, plus one covering a trilogy. They are quite diverse. Some are about progressive Christianity directly, and others address theological matters that contrast with the unchallengeable doctrines and beliefs held by more literalist Christians who consider themselves fundamentalists, conservatives, or evangelicals, or all three. Some books encourage newer forms of worship that are consistent with science and social justice for the poor and marginalised, including First Nations people. While remaining within a mainstream Trinitarian liberal faith tradition myself, I embrace and take a broad perspective on progressive Christian voices, but not uncritically. The trilogy by Ben Pugh is about theories of the atonement, how it is that Christians can be embraced by God through salvation in Jesus to become a loving new humanity. Despite his charismatic evangelical roots, Pugh's three books are interdisciplinary and seek to be objective. I draw here particularly from the first book, Atonement Theories: A Way Through the Maze. Pugh argues that having God the Father require Christ's suffering on the cross leads to an understanding of an inflexible, demanding and violent God, turning many away from the church. Instead of penal substitution, he details older traditions and atonement metaphors, such as by Irenaeus in about 180 of the Common Era on Jesus as a new representative second Adam, and Peter Abelard's about 1100 Common Era view of atonement based on love and mystical participation. The violence of the cross was human, based on seeking to retain political and religious power. Luke Burgess, in Wanting, the Power of Mimetic Desire and How to Want What You Need, is based on the work of René Girard, who most famously wrote about a different form of power, the use of the power of sacrifice and scapegoating through the centuries. Burgess's more practical book draws on Girard's concept of mimetic desire, a mimicking exacerbated by the pervasive power of consumerist culture, advertising and social media to influence why people want what they want. Part 1 of the book addresses hidden models, distorted reality, social contagion, and the invention of blame. Part 2, the transformation of desire, includes 15 tactics, typically American, bit management speak, such as disruptive empathy to help ensure that our desires are grounded in our values, and with echoes of St. Augustine's Confessions, to seek what we deeply desire. You recall St. Augustine, our heart is restless until it rests in thee, in God. Former Catholic priest Anthony Bartlett, in Signs of Change, the Bible's evolution of divine non-violence, also draws from René Girard, and in this case his transformative semiotics. Semiotics involving sign processes and meaning-making. Bartlett shows that the arbitrary and violent God of much of Exodus, Deuteronomy and Kings, also evident among some prophets, reflects the anthropology, understanding and culture of the settings, authors and compilers, and that this influenced parts of the New Testament and how it has been read. Bartlett documents the roots and signs of an alternative understanding of God and God's expectations of humanity, including compassion, forgiveness, non-violence and peace, begun in Genesis 1 and within Exodus, and developed in most of Job, 2nd Isaiah's servant passages, Ruth, Daniel and Jonah, and of course in many New Testament words and actions by Jesus and Paul. These form an alternative semiotics to challenge the dominant narrative and understanding of the Hebrew Bible and its continuing influence within the New Testament. Our own PCNet South Australia Life member, Norm Habel, has written books with similar themes and has emphasised Jeremiah's New Covenant based on love and knowledge of God from the heart. Former English teacher and American pastor Brian McLaren is internationally renowned within progressive Christianity, having published 40 books since 1998. In Do I Stay Christian, a guide for the doubters, the disappointed and the disillusioned, he engages the reality that faces many hurt and thoughtful members of congregations who have not yet left mainstream denominations and who harbour doubts about individualistic approaches to sin and salvation, are deeply disappointed by the behaviour of clergy and church leaders, and who are broadly disillusioned by simplistic preaching and theology, among many other things. After comprehensively considering the yes and no cases, McLaren provides advice on how to stay Christian if that is the choice made, using the themes include and transcend, start with the heart, rewild, find the flow, reconsecrate everything, renounce and announce, stay loyal to reality and stay human. David Caden, in Christianity in Blue, How the Bible, History, Philosophy and Theology Shape Progressive Identity, argues that the emphasis of progressive Christianity is on this life and changing this world for the benefit of people now, including by empathetically working for peace and justice. Caden maintains that biblical words tell us about people's experiences of the divine or the sacred, not what the sacred actually is. Relationship is the lens through which he reads the entire Bible. God's relationship to God's self, God's relationship to people, people's relationship to other people, people's relationship to the planet, Christianity's relationship to Judaism and to other religious traditions, and the relationship of societies privileged to societies underprivileged. For Caden, the Word of God is the word we use to describe our sense of connection, and he writes that at its core, progressive Christianity is an invitation to love the triune God. The triune God is love. At the compassionate core of progressive Christianity is a commitment to see every person as Christ sees them, as beloved human beings worthy of love and acceptance. Roger Olson's against liberal theology, putting the brakes on progressive Christianity, is by an orthodox conservative academic who statedly wishes to be fair and warm-hearted to those he disagrees with and not, quote, write a diatribe against progressive Christianity. However, his main argument is that liberal theology, citing books by Spong and Borg, and associated progressive Christianity is not authentic Christianity. Indeed, he writes that Christ does not stand alone at the centre of liberal Christianity, if at all. He defines orthodoxy as Christian theism, such that liberal and progressive Christianity is not included, and ignores some progressive Christian views, at least post-resurrection, on Jesus as the living Word and a person of the Trinity. Olson is most critical of liberal doubts with regard to miracles, the virgin birth, and the incarnate Jesus being God at birth, over-reliance on reason and modifying biblical orthodoxy in light of science and modern culture, and excessive stress on God's immanence rather than being balanced with almighty transcendence, and liberal support for panentheism, the idea that God is greater than the universe but interpenetrates everything in it. So he's critical of all of those liberal ideas as he states them. So Olson conflates contemporary liberal and progressive views with secular modernism and in contrast to postmodernism. But he ignores postmodernist questioning of grand narratives such as Christian orthodoxy. As you know, questioning is a hallmark of progressive Christianity in contrast to Olson's views on largely unchallengeable biblical authority and conservative Calvinist doctrine. Randall Rouser in Progressive Christians Love Jesus Too, a response to Elisa Childers and the Heresy Hunters, provides an extended rebuttal of a book by conservative fundamentalist Childers which criticises progressive Christianity. For Rouser, the anchor for Christianity is not sound biblical doctrine, but Jesus Christ. He writes, "Confusing God's action with our descriptions of them is a category mistake, and what is truly foundational is loving Christian relationship. Such a relationship invites honest, hard questions rather than binary thinking and blind assent to doctrines such as biblical inerrancy and penal substitutionary sacrificial atonement as propounded by Childers." Rouser emphasises that humility about knowledge is not relativism about truth. Doubt and questions do not inevitably condemn progressive Christians to hell based on Childers' New Testament selection of texts. He's also critical of the way her fundamentalism leads to defending Old Testament texts that describe God as commanding and commending the eradication of entire people groups, such as the Amalekites and Canaanites. While Professor Rouser has a strong background in historical and biblical theology and is well worth reading, at times he seems to lapse into a form of strident literalism of his own upbringing. He started off as a dispensationalist, and I don't think he's quite shaken it. Rebecca King, in The New Heretics, Skepticism, Secularism and Progressive Christianity, reports on her lengthy, embedded ethnographic PhD study of 5 churches around Toronto, 2 United Church, 2 Anglican and 1 Lutheran, to help define and understand progressive Christianity. While not herself a progressive Christian, her insider role was sympathetic. The initial driving force for progressive Christianity in these 5 Canadian churches was the writing, lecturing and pastoral presence of Bishop Spong, with whom King interacted and interviewed. She found that Toronto's progressive Christianity was more radical than in the US, with West Hill United's minister, Greta Vosper, the founder and president of the Canadian Centre for Progressive Christianity, eventually describing herself as an atheist while remaining in ministry. The church tried to remove her, but the lawyers wouldn't allow it. Many others, of course, were proud to be called anti-orthodoxy heretics and sought to make informed and ethical humanist choices and to debate theological issues, but remained worshipping Christians in these Toronto churches. Douglas Campbell in Paul, An Apostle's Journey, reconstructs Paul's life from his letters and uses this information to control the information supplied by Acts. While Campbell is more conservative than I am, his book persuasively softens a sometimes negative view of Paul held by many, such as by stressing Paul's loving ethical values for church communities that should be outward-looking. Campbell considers that for Paul, faith is not an individual condition for salvation, but rather based on the faith of Jesus. Salvation meant that resurrection is open to all. He argues that Paul was an implicit universalist, in which God's plan was that everyone should be raised in glory, pagan and Jew alike. Such views may appeal to progressive Christians seeking to respect and include others. I wrote this review to illustrate again how broader theological scholarship can be an important contributor to progressive Christian voices. Bruce Sanguin, in The Way of the Wind, The Path and Practice of Evolutionary Christian Mysticism, seeks a churchless incarnation in the human heart. Among others, Sanguin draws from Teilhard de Chardin's Omega Point, Ken Wilber's reintegration model, and the New Testament progressive Christianity scholarship of non-violence activist Walter Wink. While celebrating science and evolution, Sanguin now considers that most progressive Christianity, like many liberal and evangelical branches of the church, this is him talking, is excessively rational and arid. He says it lacks mysticism and spirituality, where mysticism involves seeking and experiencing loving union with reality and all that is. He has a chapter on practices of self-emptying evolutionary mysticism, including the use of purgative and psychedelic drugs. Well before he reached that point, he was a United Church of Canada minister who moved from liberal Christianity to more challenging forms of progressive Christianity, based on evolution and spirituality, encouraging a new emerging church, and faith based on universal and cosmic love and peace. Sanguin's 2010 book, If Darwin Prayed, Prayers for Evolutionary Mystics, provides a wonderful resource for progressive Christianity, both individually and liturgically as a congregation. Several of the collected prayer poems are available free online to be sampled. Late last year, the 50th anniversary of the classic book on liberation theology by the now 95-year-old Gustavo Gutierrez, The Theology of Liberation, History and Politics and Salvation, was published with a new introduction. I first read it 40 years ago and it remains fresh and rich, perhaps more so because of the influence it has had, not only encouraging preferential options for the poor, you may know that clause, and the oppressed of Latin America, but more broadly in focusing on God's kingdom now, not just in some heavenly end time. Gutierrez urged a theologically informed, interdisciplinary, structural response to inequality and injustice around the world. He also greatly influenced other theologies of the marginalised, feminist, black, rainbow, and so forth. Sally Douglas in Jesus Sophia, returning to woman wisdom in the Bible, practice and prayer, provides an accessible update on her PhD thesis, which is well worth reading, by the way, and free online, with worship and practice suggestions. Douglas is a Melbourne-based Uniting Church minister. She acknowledges pioneering feminist Christian biblical scholarship about Sophia by Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza and Elizabeth Johnson, but takes the evidence further. In particular, the book shows that Sophia, or woman wisdom, in Old Testament and intertestamental material included knowing God from the beginning, transformative wisdom, non-violent anger at injustice, compassion, mercy and peace, vulnerable love, inviting all to a feast of abundance, abiding with God and us in freedom, and sustaining all things. Douglas argues that these characteristics were demonstrated by Jesus in his actions and sometimes in quoting or speaking as Sophia. Douglas encourages questions and discussion, but is critical of a progressive Christianity that she thinks shuns religious experience and encounter with the divine. Sarah Agnew, in Embodied Performance, Mutuality, Embrace and a Letter to Rome, wrote this book based on her University of Edinburgh PhD thesis. It's available from her as Minister in Placement here at Christchurch or from MediaCom. She didn't ask for the promo. Her website outlines her roles as a storyteller, poet and scholar. Pioneering scholarship on Mark's Gospel by David Rhodes and colleagues included an emphasis on Mark as story and the importance of considering how it was spoken to and received by its original audiences, and can be similarly powerfully spoken and performed for contemporary congregations and their contexts. Agnew extends this by an emphasis on embodied performance with her own performed and critiqued exemplars. This develops newer forms of biblical interpretation that include narrative criticism and biblical performance criticism. Agnew's work incorporates different sacred terminology, and new forms of storytelling, hymnody, poetry and art are used and celebrated in progressive Christian worship services here at the moment. In conclusion, let me summarise some key contributions of the progressive Christian voices we have surveyed. Negative reactions to them have helped illustrate the contributions, I hope. Of course, we can't claim material by Pugh, Bartlett, Bergen, Gutierrez, Campbell and Douglas as being by progressive Christians, but alternative views of the atonement, biblical non-violence, addressing mimetic desire, liberation theology with service to the poor, Pauline universalism, and feminist theology with a better understanding of how aspects of both genders flow from images of the Godhead are entirely consistent with and even necessary, I would argue, for progressive Christianity and its contemporary voices. So Sir Lloyd Gearing and the book Why Weren't We Told provides a helpful platform to understand the history of progressive Christianity and its contemporary themes. Bishop Jack Spong is important, in particular, for addressing both pastorally and as adults those who have left the church and who might be poised to do so, and encouraging their questioning. Brian McLaren has continued this emphasis. Rouser's critique of fundamentalist conservative evangelicals like Alyssa Childers, who attack progressive Christianity and its proponents, so she does play mostly the man, is understandable, but veers towards a different form of dogmatic intellectualism. Rebecca King's Canadian research celebrates progressive Christianity's humble questions, doubts, and anti-orthodox heresy, but the Reverend Greta Vosper's atheism stands as a salutary warning of the dangers of purely humanist intellectualism. Bruce Sanguin, at least in his less exotic period, has provided liturgical prayer poetry drawing from recent physics, cosmology and evolutionary biology, and including a mystical panentheistic spirituality linking the divine and all creation. David Caden has endorsed seeking biblical texts that are congruent with current knowledge and emphasises relationship, compassion, practical service, love and acceptance. And Sarah Agnew uses and extends new tools of narrative and performative biblical criticism and the arts to embody and enrich contemporary faith and worship. Progressive Christianity as a reaction to and correction of dogmatic fundamentalism has sometimes been overly intellectual, as suggested by both Sanguin and Douglas. In my view, we can continue to be scientific and rational, progressive Christians while using head, heart and body combined holistically in a truly human manner, as Agnew exemplifies. Indeed, I consider that this is essential in our living and worship as we seek to follow Holy One in the mystery and love of the Three-in-One, to serve our fellow human beings and steward the diversity and life of our imperilled planet. Thank you for your attention.
Well, I feel as if we all need to take a deep breath.
Yes.
I was really struck tonight of what an act of generosity it is for someone like Kym to have done all this thinking and research and then share it with us. So, Kym, thank you. There's so much there to digest. I'd like to suggest that first of all, everybody stand and take a few deep breaths, and if you wish, consult the person next to you, because we'll be asking for your questions afterwards. But stand and breathe, and have a wriggle if you choose. When you're ready, if you take your seat. This is the second and last time. To hear your questions, you'll need to indicate that you have a question, and then Jonathan will come to you with the microphone. So please don't speak until you're holding the microphone. It's called sharing. So who has a question? Jess.
A very interesting lecture on the variety of belief circuits. What got you into that?
Well, sort of Janine gave the game away. You know, I'm a perpetual student, even if I'm doing other things. So as a break from my PhD research, I do this on the side. But look, I think it's really important, actually. That's what got me into it, is that people need to be able to think and talk about different ideas about theology and not just be stuck into a narrow doctrine. And if we do that, we're going to lose a lot of people.
Yeah. You've got to have an open mind
good. Jess said you have to have an open mind and a focused heart. Thank you.
Following on from that, to what extent do you think that the progressive Christianity is contributing to the future of the church at the moment?
Well, I think if it was just a reaction to fundamentalism and it was similarly arid and dry and intellectual, it wouldn't have a lot to add, frankly. I mean, it still has something to add because it, shows the paucity of thought in some forms of literalism. But it's the sort of stuff I was talking about with, Sarah Agnew in particular, our minister. If you're looking at various different forms of bringing the arts into worship, changing some of the words in hymnody, because as we all know, when dementia strikes, some of the last things to remain are the hymns that we used to sing. That's where we get more theology. No one's going to remember tonight. No one's going to remember your minister's sermons, but they're going to remember the hymns. So to change the words into something that's actually meaningful and links in with scientific knowledge, because it shouldn't be one or the other, then there's a contribution there. So I think bringing in all that richness of arts, hymnody, etc. is the contribution for the future.
I was remembering Sean Connery, and I think it's The Name of the Rose is the film, Umberto Eco, and there the heresy is having a sense of humour. And sometimes I think progressive Christianity, we haven't really examined that perspective.
Yep.
Is that my mistake?
Look, I don't think so. I think having a sense of humour is good in all things. So whenever I'm at a meeting, I attempt to have a sense of humour because I think it works better. It doesn't mean that you're not serious. But if you're too serious about yourself, you're probably not thinking. So probably the two things go together. Play is the other thing. Humour and play, I think, are very important. And both can be absolutely linked to spirituality and Christianity.
Kym, how much of this material that you have shared tonight would be shared with theological students at the seminary?
That I can't answer, but there are probably those here who might be able to help you after. And I suspect, like everything, it'll depend on which theological college you go to, right? Because even within the Uniting Church, we all know there's a great diversity of theologies, which is one of the reasons it's so hard to find a way forward. And this Act 2 process that's going to Assembly in July is going to be very tricky.
Another weird question from me. With this diversity and ever-expanding University of Christianity, is there a risk of losing integrity?
Of course, but there's I think, it's a great sorrow that there are so many denominations and they've been so violently and negatively speaking to each other, and when you do that, you can easily lose integrity. But, much of Christianity isn't growing. I mean, there's a bit, particularly at the Pentecostal end, that still is, but even they're having trouble now. But certainly in the Western world, Africa and Latin America is a bit different. But, yeah, I'm sure. Now, there was a question up the back.
You just touched on some of it, actually, because you mentioned that progressive Christianity is often the theology for the herd and those who are doubting Christianity and stuff. But then you mentioned its contribution to the future was all around the hymnody and the way we do worship. But that requires us getting the doubters shouting and they're hurting in the doors there. How do we reach out anywhere better to do that?
Well, that's very difficult, and it depends on your view of Christianity. I mean, my view is that it's not a numbers game. It's more important that we contribute to society as salt and light, and go from there. Others count conversions. So I'm not so much, I mean, I am of course worried that we don't have anyone coming through the doors, and I hope that giving an opportunity for people to think, and the fellowship and service that can be done together is an attraction, but of course that can be done in a humanist way too. So ultimately, if there's not an emotional and spiritual involvement, it's not going to happen, and there still does seem to be a yearning for that. If you look at, some of the data from the Christian Life Survey, the censuses, and all the rest of it. So, and as the world sort of spirals down into horrible stuff, you never know. There may be a new revival. So it's up to us who are thinking and maybe practicing Christians that, to be there ready to help when that may happen. But anyway, it's not numbers.
I just remembered that if we do have that ability to minister, we need to be louder than some of the other voices out there, so that people know there is that help to be given. Because I know lots of people that think Christianity means Donald Trump, and they, like me, don't want any part of that.
Absolutely right. And as Sean Gilbert said in the opening lecture, there's got to be some humility about it. Now, I wasn't particularly humble tonight because that wasn't my purpose, but in talking to others, that's really important too. Okay.
Well, we're going to be having supper in a little while, but maybe you'd like to take this opportunity to talk to the people who are near you and share some of your thinking if you weren't brave enough to use the mic. So please feel free to turn to the people near you and share some reflections, and then we'll be ready for supper. Just before we move and get our refreshments, Kym has said that someone's already asked whether the content could be made available, because There really was a lot of content there tonight, wasn't there? And the answer is yes, and it will go up on our website shortly. Slightly more than 24 hours. But so I think we'll all appreciate being able to see the detail. And Don is going to tell you about the coming events.
I'm sure those of you who've been involved in the last couple of sessions will realise that this is a first-class program that we've put together this year. And if pride's a sin, I guess we're sinners. We think it's pretty good. We're very proud of it. Esmond Dowdy was to have spoken tonight, but Esmond had been ill, and so with great grace and fortitude, Kym did a swap, bringing forward his presentation so that we could have Esmond next time. So on May the 2nd, we will hear from Esmond speaking on the significance of the spirituality revolution, the significance of the spirituality revolution. And I think from what you've heard from Kym tonight would make you realise that in our lifetimes we've seen a significant change in the way Christianity is practised, and if you can call that a revolution, that's great. Now, Fergus is making signs at me from the back because we were shocked to find that we couldn't find our evaluation sheets tonight. But I think you now have them, Fergus. It would help us immensely if you could fill in the evaluation. It's very simple. We just ask for a couple of numbers on a scale of 1 to 6. You'll notice there's no intermediate, no middle position. We want you to make a decision. So on a scale of 1 to 6, and any comments you might have about tonight's presentation. This will be a significant help to us in planning for the future. So the only matter that remains is to enjoy a cup of tea or coffee and some nibbles with us and a bit of fellowship. So thank you ever so much for coming. It's been a great night.